You guys know that I run these €50 budget commander tournaments. This is basically CEDH, but, well, with a budget restriction of €50. It's quite popular and, honestly, incredibly competitive. There are a lot of people that participate in these tournaments that take them very seriously. They practice ahead of time, they build decks very carefully and over long periods of time. And once the deck lists are out, which they are public, I make them public after everybody has submitted theirs, they sit down and research the deck lists of their opponents and try to figure out how to best play around them and how to beat them. Our last tournament took place last Sunday, although by the time you see this, it would have been 2 Sundays ago. Either way, I prepared a Shorekai Genesis engine deck. It was this incredibly controlling list that was all about stalling the game and eventually winning by using an Isochron Scepter dramatic reversal combo. I hated it. It was good, it worked, but god, it wasn't fun to play. The theory was that even if I can't win, I can just play the game into a draw. I spent a lot of time on the deck, building, refining and testing it. But then, the weekend before the actual tournament, we had one evening where we had 8 people all come together to just sit down and play tournament matches, to practice properly. During that evening, I played the Shorekai deck, 4 or 5 matches in a row, and I got so bored of it. Oh my god, I just hated it. It just wasn't fun. So I realized I don't want to spend a whole day at the tournament playing this slow controlling deck, even though it might succeed, just because I don't really like it. That gave me 2 days to build a new deck and 1 evening to test it. So not a lot of time. I needed to build something that I already mostly knew how it worked. I already had to be familiar with it. And of course, it needed to be strong enough to actually compete. And there was only one card that really fit those criteria, and that is 6. You guys have heard me talk about this commander quite a lot around here because I think he's just incredibly powerful, stupidly powerful. And so I'm just like, you know what? I'm just gonna try it. I'm just gonna put a list together and try to make it as strong as I possibly can. And then I went to my usual Wednesday evening commander night. I played a little bit and honestly, I was quite happy with it. It felt powerful, it felt interactive, and most importantly, I actually had a good time playing it. So I locked it in for the tournament. Let me just spoil the rest of the story. I won the tournament. I am now our only 2-time winner here, and I did it with 2 completely different decks, which I'm feeling kind of smug about. I actually had a pretty dominant victory. I think the most dominant victory out of anyone that participated yet. I won 3 out of the 4 matches, and the only game that I lost, I really should have won. I just made a misplay. Like, I let my deck down. My deck would have won that game if it was played perfectly. I just didn't play it perfectly. However, even though I won, I don't think I can play this deck a second time. And that's because I mostly won because nobody actually knew what to do against my deck. As I said, people do research our players' deck lists. But when looking at mine, they just didn't know what to make of it. And I know that for certain because I had multiple people, multiple top competitors in our local scene at the tournament come up to me and just straight up tell me, I don't know how your deck works. And I think that's really cool. So today, I want to show you some really silly mono-green combo lines that helped me win a tournament. Of course, the centerpiece of our deck is 6, our commander. 6 is a 3-mana 2/4 with reach that whenever he attacks, he mills 3, and then we get to put a land from the milled cards in our hand. And during our turn, we can play non-land permanent cards out of our graveyard with retrace, which means we discard a land in addition to paying the card's regular costs. This last effect is insane in a deck that's built for it, which this one is. It literally only plays 2 non-permanents. There is Beast Within and Life from the Gnome, and everything else is a permanent. 6 also needs a lot of lands, because we need to discard lands to be able to play cards out of our graveyard. So I play 47. I play 46 forests and 1 sun-scorched desert. Yeah, that definitely helped a lot with the budget restriction, so that was part of the reason why I wanted to play this deck. Now, this may be a mono-green deck, but it is not a combat-focused deck. It can go a creature combat route, and that was actually part of the reason why I won the tournament, because I managed to take out the player that was the most problematic for me personally by just killing him in the finals, which, you know, that's nice. Don't need to worry about the blue-white control player if they're dead. So, you know, we can do that. But ultimately, this is a combo deck. It is here to kill with an infinite loop. Now, there are two prerequisites that we have to fulfill while playing 6, which is we have to mill ourselves so we get access to our cards, and we need to make sure we have enough mana to use them. For that, we play mana doublers, like Gauntlet of Power, Syndica Resurgent, or Mana Reflection. Very simple, straightforward cards that just make it so our lands tap for extra mana. Once we have these cards in play, we might not have infinite mana yet, but you know, 20 is pretty close to infinite, so that works pretty nicely. The self-milling is equally simple. Cards like Perpetual Timepiece and Branchwood Prowler simply mill us for a bunch of cards. The best versions of these effects also add lands to our hand, which of course means we can play the cards we milled with the land we just got. Once we have mana and our graveyard set up, we go for some sort of mid-game setup combo. Yes, we use the setup to set up even more. So for example, cards like Circle of the Land Druid, Blanchwood Prowler, or Satyr Wayfinder, all of which do the same thing. They just mill us and then add a land into our hand at some point, work great if we can sacrifice them and then just replay them over and over again. And for that, we have Claws of Gigs, which is actually one of my favorite cards in this deck. Not only because it is really old and weird, and most people look at it and think to themselves, why would anybody play this? But also, I just really like the artwork. It's actually quite unique. It's one of the few cards in Magic that isn't a painting. This is actually a photograph, which is cool, isn't it? Claws of Gigs is a 0-mana artifact that for 1 mana, and by sacrificing a permanent, lets us gain 1 life. Yay! That's amazing, isn't it? Now, this may not seem that good at first glance, but it means we can just sacrifice anything we want. And if we can sacrifice things, that means we can put them into our graveyard. And if they're in our graveyard, we can just play them again. And that's incredibly valuable in a deck like this, where we are constantly looking to reuse our effects. Of course, that's not our only sacrifice outlet. We also play Greater Good, but Greater Good is actually worse in this deck because a lot of these creatures here aren't that strong, although they can get strong once we have some additional things in play. You'll see in a moment. Oh, and really quick, don't forget to give the video a thumbs up. I would really appreciate that. Another way for us to get a lot of mana into play very quickly is Sakura Tribe Elder. Good old Steve is pretty straightforward. Just sacrifice it to fetch out a basic and put it into play. Of course, since Steve just sacrifices himself, we can just immediately replay him. This is particularly good if we have cards like Tireless Provisioner or Spelunking in play, which allow us to turn the land that comes into play into immediate mana. Spelunking makes it so that the land enters untapped, and Tireless Provisioner creates a treasure. Both are good ways for us to play Steve repeatedly. Now, to make sure that we have enough lands in our hand for all of these shenanigans, we of course play Life from the Loam, the most important card in the entire deck, the most powerful card in the entire deck. Life from the Loam is very straightforward. It's a 2-mana sorcery that just says return up to 3 target land cards from your graveyard to your hand. Life from the Loam also has Dredge Free, which means if we were to draw a card, we can instead mill 3 cards, which is good, that's an upside for us, and then return Life from the Loam from our graveyard to our hand. Life from the Loam effectively draws us 3 cards a turn, and during these mid-game, early-game setup phases, that is plenty to do anything we want to do. From here, we can go into some nastier lines. These usually involve either Cavalier of Thorns or Fecund Greenshell alongside Springheart Nantuko. Springheart Nantuko bestows onto a creature for 2 mana, and then whenever a land enters the battlefield under our control, we can pay 2 additional mana to create a copy of the creature that Springheart Nantuko is bestowed upon. This works incredibly well with Cavalier of Thorns. Cavalier of Thorns is a 5-mana creature that when it enters, we mill 5 cards and then put a land from the mill cards directly into play. This land enters untapped, which is actually really important for us because keep in mind we play mana doublers. These mana doublers then make it so that this untapped land can immediately be used to pay for Springheart Nantuko, and that then means we get to mill our entire deck on the spot. It's actually kind of an infinite by itself. It doesn't win us the game, but once we have our entire deck in the graveyard, I mean, it's kind of hard to lose. Fecund Greenshell isn't quite as effective at milling us, but has some additional benefits. Fecund Greenshell is a 5-mana turtle with stats that don't matter, who cares? However, its butt is bigger than its bite, and that's what's important for this card, because whenever it or another creature that has more toughness than power enters the battlefield, we get to look at the top card of our library, and if it's a land, we get to put it directly into play, and otherwise, we can just put it into our hand. What's important here is that we don't actually have to put the land into play. We can just put it into our hand if we need it there, which is very much a possibility with this deck. Fecund Greenshell alongside Springheart Nantuko gets very silly very quickly, because we can duplicate the Fecund Greenshell and then we have 2 which trigger each other. And then, you know, they look for lands, and if we manage to hit a land, the land comes into play, we pay 2 mana, then again, we now have 3 Fecund Greenshells. And these check each other, so we have 3 triggers. We do the same thing again, put a land into play, probably, I mean we play 47 of them. So we put another land into play, create ourselves a 4th Fecund Greenshell, which yet again gives us 4 triggers. This gets out of hand very easily, and we can have 10, 15 of these triggers stacked on top of each other. If we then have a way of turning the tapped lands that enter into mana, like for example Spelunking or Tireless Provisioner, well then we might as well just pick up our deck and put it into our hand. And this is where Fecund Greenshell's second ability becomes really important, because what that says is as long as you control 10 or more lands, creatures you control get +2/+2. It is possible for us to just create 40 Greenshells, give our board +80/+80, and you know, just swing the little wieners we had during the early game at people to kill them. It's not the primary plan, but it does work. Springheart Nantuko is just generally a very silly card. We can also use it with, for example, Steve. Putting a Springheart Nantuko onto a Steve, then playing a land, we get ourselves a second Steve. We sacrifice the clone Steve, which gets a land, and all of a sudden we have our entire lands in play. This is not necessarily good though. We might not actually want all of the lands from our deck in play, but, you know, we can do it, which is pretty cool. That leads us to our first win line, which is pretty much just a Fecund Greenshell line, except, of course, we have to assume that none of the creatures we had on the board at the beginning of the turn can attack. That's just kind of how you have to build a tournament deck, right? You kind of need to assume that your shit is getting killed all the time. So, we play Endrace Forerunners. Endrace Forerunners, just a 7/7 overrun on a creature that has haste, which is very important, because with the Endrace Forerunners, we can just throw those down with the Fecund Greenshells, buff everything up, doesn't really matter, at which point we play Seal of Primordium to destroy our own Springheart Nantuko, then enchant the Springheart Nantuko onto the Endrace Forerunners out of our graveyard, and then play 2 more lands, create 2 more Endrace Forerunners, and just kill our opponents with a horde of pigs. The problem with this line, of course, is that it is kind of open to our opponents just responding to us. Like, it may sound silly, but Fog just stops this, and it's not that crazy for people to play some response along those lines. I mean, it's probably not Fog, but you know, Aetherise exists, and that's not that unlikely to be effective. So this is actually not the deck's primary win line. It's just a line that exists coincidentally because I felt like it was easy enough to include by just putting in Endrace Forerunners. No, our primary win line is way more unhinged than that. We need 6 in play and some sort of mana doubler. The mana doubler is not necessary if we're using Zoran Orb for the combo line, but if we are trying to use Claws of Gix instead, then we do need a mana doubler. Zoran Orb and Claws of Gix are our sacrifice outlets. Now, if we are going for the Zoran Orb line, we also need specifically Aftermath Analyst, but if we have access to Claws of Gix, we can use World Shaper instead. On top of this, we need Spelunking, which is very important because it makes it so that our lands enter untapped. Then, we want to make sure we have access to Life from the Loam and some card that draws a card. 1 card draw, and that's very important. We don't want to draw more than 1 card. We need to draw specifically 1 card, and it needs to be on something that we can use repeatedly. Step 1, we tap all of our lands and add a bunch of mana into our pool. Then we sacrifice all of the lands, throw them into the graveyard. We don't want them anymore. At this point, we can then sacrifice Aftermath Analyst to its own ability or World Shaper to Claws of Gix, which returns all of the lands from our graveyard back into play. Spelunking will make sure that they enter untapped, so we can immediately tap them again to generate a bunch of mana. By doing this repeatedly, we can create infinite mana. However, to do it repeatedly, we need to have access to an infinite supply of lands in our hand, because every time we recast Aftermath Analyst or World Shaper, we need to discard a land to do it. That's what Life from the Loam is for. What we can do is we just sacrifice 3 of our lands and then return them with Life from the Loam. To then get Life from the Loam back, we play a card out of our graveyard that draws us a card, for example, Insidious Fungus. Insidious Fungus is a 1-mana creature that for 2 mana we can sacrifice to draw a card. So we play Insidious Fungus, sacrifice it, and then replace the card draw with a Dredge from Life from the Loam to return Life from the Loam to our hand. With Life from the Loam in our hand, again we sacrifice 3 lands, play Life from the Loam, return those 3 lands to our hand, and then we can recast Aftermath Analyst and Insidious Fungus out of our graveyard. You may notice we even have an excess land. This way we are back in our previous state. We have created a loop with the only change to the board being that we have milled 3 cards, or more cards if we are using Aftermath Analyst for it. Going forward, we want to make sure that we never draw more than 1 card to ensure that we can replace that card draw with the Dredge so that we don't lose from decking out. Once we have milled our entire deck into our graveyard, we will eventually find Sun-Scorched Desert. And then our loop, which again kills all of our lands and reanimates them over and over again, that uses 8 different pieces, will also deal 1 damage to 1 opponent every time we do it. And then we win the game. So this is of course very silly. It's a combo line that uses 7 to 8 cards. But the nice thing is that we can usually get there. That's what these in-between combo lines are for, right? They build us to the point that we have access to all of these resources. It's not flawless, of course. We can run into the problem of somebody graveyard hating us out of the game. Luckily, I never had to play against Rest in Peace, even though some people had it in their deck, so I got quite lucky there. But I did end up having to deal with just like general graveyard hate. The important thing there is though, first of all, people didn't know which of the cards in my deck are actually the combo pieces. I mean, would you look at World Shaper and say, wait, that's the combo line? No, right? That's nonsense. But even if somebody figured out to take out our most crucial piece, which is Life from the Loam, the deck actually has a really funny backup line. So here's what we do in case somebody hits Life from the Loam. We still go through our line, and honestly, even without Life from the Loam, the deck can usually generate enough mana that it's basically infinite. Well, we have Sorin Orb in play, we play Hedron Archive or Yavimaya Elder, it doesn't matter which one, just one of them is fine. Then, we also play Perpetual Timepiece, we sacrifice all of our lands, and then we use Perpetual Timepiece to shuffle the lands back into our deck. So we have a deck that is only lands, there's nothing else in there. What we do then is we sacrifice either Yavimaya Elder or Hedron Archive to get ourselves lands. Hedron Archive is the easier example, so I will just explain that really quick, but we can just sacrifice it to its own ability to draw 2 cards. Then we use one of those lands to replay the Hedron Archive, sacrifice it again to then, draw 2 lands. We use one to replay the Hedron Archive. You get it. Then eventually we just play Endray's Forerunners, enchant Springheart Nantuko onto it, and somehow get our lands into play with one of our many ways of doing so. For example, that Insidious Fungus from earlier, which not only draws us a card, but also lets us put a land from our hand directly into play. That way, we can then duplicate the Endray's Forerunners a couple of times. You don't actually need that many, 10 is plenty, that kills the table, and then we win that way. I think this deck is just so hilarious because it is truly unhinged. It has combo lines that require 7-8 pieces. It simply does not play enough interaction to properly stop people from doing stuff. And that was legitimately my plan. I would just sit down at a table and tell people, y'all, I've got one beast within, and that's it. I mean, technically speaking, that's not entirely true because I have a pithing needle and so on, so I can respond proactively, but reactively is very difficult. But you know, what that did is it gave me the opportunity to just kind of focus on myself. Everybody else knew I wasn't really gonna help them control the problem players, so they needed to use their resources to deal with them, while I just sat over there and did my own thing. This is definitely not a strategy that will work again. If I show up with this deck to a second tournament, not only will everybody play Rest in Peace, but also they're just gonna target me down. And if you target me down, I'm gonna have a hard time. Like, that's just a problem. However, I still feel pretty happy that I managed to win. And I just felt like the deck was funny enough and weird enough that it was worth talking about. I do promise now that this is the last time I will talk about 6. We're done. It's okay. We don't need to keep bringing up 6. I could keep talking about the boy forever, but yeah. I now need to figure out what I'm playing for the next tournament. We're doing one of these every 2 months. I've got an idea for like an explore themed deck. It's just a Simic value pile. I was thinking it would be funny if it didn't play a win condition and it just kind of smacked people to death with 2/1 merfolks. Or maybe I just built something good. I don't know yet. I haven't decided. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. This was something really simple, but I just wanted to talk about it. And I hope that's all right. That's all right, right? That's all right. Anyways, don't forget to give the video a thumbs up, and I'll see you guys soon.